For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'm speaking to some of Australia's best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea?, brought to you by the Australia Institute. Today, I'm speaking with Louise Adler, whose entire professional life has been in the cultural sphere. As a board member, CEO, and artistic director, she was CEO and publisher of Melbourne University Press and is currently director of Adelaide Writers Week. Hello, Louise.
Hello. Good morning, Paul.
How would you describe the overall state of the arts and culture sectors in Australia right now?
Tumultuous times, I guess, for the industry as a whole. Has it ever been thus? I suspect it has. We've also always had to kind of fight for funding. The ratio of government support to private support has kind of changed really significantly over the last 2 decades, I'd say at least. I think there are different issues in different parts of the arts industry as a whole, or arts community, however you want to describe it. But I think the challenge around funding, sources of funding and governance, there's a uniformity or a kind of, there's a sense that the same issues apply in all of the different sectors. They take they take on various hues, but funding, for example, I keep on banging on about funding because that seems to me to be paramount. If there was more money, a lot of problems would be solved.
Working as an artist has always been a precarious occupation. Is it particularly precarious now?
Well, I know the sector that I know most deeply is the book industry, the publishing industry. And I think we're talking about something like an annual salary for most writers of something like $13,000 or $14,000 a year. That's not a living wage. It has long not been a living wage. We're not like other countries where governments have decided that they will put artists, writers on an annual salary and enable them to write for a living. That's never happened here. We've never won that argument. There's been no interest in that argument from successive governments of either hues. So particularly for writers, it's an extraordinarily difficult time. I know that visual artists have exactly the same problem. And I'm sure that people who are working in the performing arts, when they're not working, what are they doing? They're waitressing, they're driving taxis, they're teaching, and they're freelancing, they're cobbling together a living that allows them sometimes to work in their art form.
I feel like I've been having this discussion for decades, and you must feel the same, that public funding for the arts has been in long-term decline for decades. Yet, the arts sector is a large employer, makes a significant economic contribution, let alone cultural contribution. All of us engage with the arts in some form or another. Why is it so unloved by governments when it comes to dipping into the budget and generously funding our arts organisations?
I'm not sure. I think some governments have had an antipathy, like there's an antipathy to the academy. I think there's a bit of an antipathy or a disinclination to support the arts, as if it's an indulgence. And that if you want to go off and indulge your passion, good luck to you, but we're not here to support you. Against that, there's the reality that health, education, social services, there are very significant areas of need in our community. And I would say, well, arts are paramount. They make for psychological well-being. They make for physical well-being. They are at the heart of our national story. Easy for me to say, but I think if you're in government, there are lots of competing areas of dire need.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Australia Institute did some research on this and found during COVID, over half of all Australians reported an increase in their appreciation of musicians, writers, actors, dancers, and so on. Yet it was precisely in that COVID period that artists were hit most heavily, kind of singled out from the rest of the community with really no job keeper assistance. Since COVID, how has the industry picked itself up?
Picked itself up, maybe post-COVID, and the cost of living issues, the pressures, have meant that bringing people to live performance, for example, the performing arts, we're not back to where we were pre-COVID. all the costs. We all talk about the costs have all gone up by 30%. So the ticket prices are 30% more expensive. You know what we need to pay artists to make the work, 30% more expensive. All of the costs associated with making work and putting it on have gone up. So that means it's very difficult. So you're persuading people to go to the theatre or to go to an opera, and it's going to cost them a couple of $100 plus the parking, plus the babysitting, and it becomes prohibitive. So we have not certainly regained where we were pre-COVID. In terms of the book industry, I can speak specifically that COVID was a great time for reading, and those books that were published, and very few books were published, there were lots of delays in the publishing cycle because you couldn't get all of the promotion and publicity activities going that you would ordinarily do. A lot of books were delayed, but those books that were published during COVID were immensely popular. Julia Baird's book, Phosphorescence, was one of those that really hit the zeitgeist of us in COVID and in seclusion, if you like, and being isolated from one another. Julia sold brilliantly. It was a fantastic success. So people clamoured for it. I mean, I think it was a great moment for reading, for children and for young adults and for adults. But in the main, the aftermath of COVID has not helped us restore. We are not where we were 3 years ago.
Yes, the dilemma, of course, is that with less funding, you have to put up ticket prices to cover the costs. As ticket prices go up, in a cost of living crisis, fewer people can afford the tickets, so attendances are down. I was thinking it must be rather nice curating a writers' festival that is free for the public to attend, Louise, as you do.
It's a gift. It's a gift. Well, it's a gift from the South Australian government, successive Australian governments, and we have to acknowledge, I think it was Don Dunstan who called Adelaide the Athens of the South. So it means it's accessible. And in 2024, 155,000 people came to the gardens to listen to writers from all over the world talk about a range of issues. It was fantastic, and I think people recognise that. And as a consequence of the festival being free, attending the festival being free, we have the largest book sales of any festival in the country. So the payoff, if you like, was that actually there were benefits for writers and publishers and for readers who would go to our book tent and buy lots of copies of books, which was wonderful to see. If you're talking about encouraging a reading nation, that is certainly one way to do it, but it depends on the munificence to be the beneficiary of state support.
Yes, I've been on those stages at the Adelaide Writers Week, and one feels like a rock star. There are so many people who attend. Let's look at, as public funding is decreasing, arts organisations are increasingly relying on corporate funding, sponsorship, philanthropy. How much more reliant are they on the private dollar these days?
Oh, I think that, if it was 70-30, I think it's turned around 70% government funding to 30% sponsor, donor private support. A decade ago, it's certainly turned around. I can't speak for every single arts organisation, but as a general rule, I think that's what's happened. And that brings with it its own complexities.
Indeed. And look, I'm sure that money is gratefully received. Arts organisations employ people in this area to get the corporate dollars coming in. It's great, lubricates the wheels of the organisation. Does it come with strings attached, though?
Of course. As it has always done, patronage has its price. And I've just been watching the film The Brutalist, which I'd love people to see because I think it's really interesting, been lots of criticisms of it. But if you want to talk about the relationship between the patron, the wealthy, and the artist/architect, it's a beautiful metaphor. It gives you a very great insight into what that dynamic can be. So I think it does come with strings attached to it. I think that benefactors, individual donors, have every right to sort of examine the arts organisation that's asking for their munificence and to say your values or what you do does not align with my own values and I'm therefore not going to support your activities. That's the good right of the generous donor. On the other hand, I think that arts organisations have to look at the gift of sponsorship and donations and say, do the values of those donors and patrons align with ours? So I don't think it's not one decides to the other. I think it's a reciprocal relationship. And I think arts organisations have to be just as scrupulous and do their due diligence on the relationships that they're wanting with donors, with private patrons, or with corporate sponsors, if you like, prior to jumping into those relationships.
This is so tricky, delicate. You've written that in the past, philanthropists tended to leave the artistic and curatorial decisions to the arts organisations themselves, by and large, but you've noticed this is less the case now, that there are certain expectations, a greater sense of entitlement, I think is how you described it, that comes with the funding of the arts. How is that manifesting itself?
Well, you're seeing that, we are in politically feverish times, or heightened times, if you like, and you can see the relationship of, for example, patrons who are very supportive of the arts, who then see work which artists taking a particular political position, either within the work they're presenting or in their bows they take at the end of the work, and patrons being offended, objecting to, feeling intimidated or unsafe by the presence of politics in the space of the arts, literally in this on stage before you. I'm not sure that what the relationship of arts organisations and artists should be to the discomfort of patrons. From my point of view, and certainly Adelaide Writers Week, we wouldn't accept race speech, hatred, violence, obscenity. None of those things are accord with the values of our organisations. But beyond that, we're entering a tricky patch where we need to have some sort of agreement between the audience and the artists and the work they're presenting about what the obligations of each are.
It strikes me, Louise, you are, and your kind of body of work indicates that you are a pluralist, in that you have been enthusiastically publicising books that have come out under your organisation's moniker that I don't think would necessarily align with your own personal politics. So you understand the broad role here. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the conversations you have with potential sponsors, with potential philanthropists before they come on board, how do those conversations kind of play out in terms of them wanting to be generous supporters of an arts event or an arts organisation that you've been a part of? Do you have to talk through what that buys them, whether that buys them a seat at the table, or just give us a sense of how that conversation plays out?
Well, I'm noticing that many arts organisations are now developing a guide for donors, a guide for sponsors. And we have codes of conduct for artists, of course, and for our own organisations. But I'm noticing that many other arts organisations around the country are becoming much more specific about the protocols, what one gets for one's dollar, and what's the relationship. What are you entitled to? Does it entitle you to say that work is unacceptable, you should not be putting that work on? I think myself personally, if a donor wants to say to me, well, I really didn't think that was of interest, I need to hear that. I can be respectful. I should be respectful of that individual's opinion, but it's simply an opinion. Maybe I agree, maybe I don't agree, but can't influence the proper judgment and curatorial independence of the artist or the direct curator or of the organisation. And
is that understood by potential donors?
I think not always. I think we've seen it. We've seen the intervention of donors who are on boards, because arts boards in the last decade or so at least have increasingly been the place for benefactors, significant benefactors, to get seats at the board table. Well, when we have that crossover, if you like, of I'm a serious funder and I'm on the board of an arts organisation, then my views are heard and received loud and clear and can be influential. I think that's problematic.
Yeah, there are some examples we can point to here. 2023 Sydney Theatre Company production, 3 actors come to the curtain call wearing a keffiyeh to express solidarity with Palestinians. Social and political expression by artists is scarcely an unknown thing, but that is all it is, a gesture. Remind us of the blowback that occurred in the aftermath of that gesture.
I think there was an enormous amount of blowback. I think Sydney Theatre Company, I may not have this correct, I'm not inside their organisation, I think they lost 1.5 million in sponsorship and support, donors, as a result of that. I think the Sydney Theatre Company, did they handle the dialogue well enough? I think the artists would say we weren't supported by the Sydney Theatre Company. They were disappointed in the management's response to that, and they're under enormous pressure. And of course, you have the media that relishes, well, particularly the Murdoch press, that relishes, a stoush in the arts. There's a sort of prurient, pleasure, if you like, a voyeuristic pleasure in, detailing day after day the interstices of the argument. But it seemed to me to be a crossroads, if you like, for people. So the artists would say, well, we have every right. We're taking a bow. It's our moment. And the the management of the organisation said, well, actually, it's part of the play. You're hired by us. There's an employment relationship. You're employees at this point, and this is part of the theatre. So it's not that you are independent artists separate from us at this point. It's a discussion. It's an interesting discussion to sort of, but it had enormous blowback.
The last Adelaide Festival I attended, I think it was your first as the director of Writers Week, and it was a rather tumultuous beginning for you in that role. You invited some Palestinian writers to attend that festival, and you faced a backlash as a result of it. Remind us about that.
Yes. Well, it was a manufactured backlash. Very interesting. Members of the Jewish community, or members of the established organisations within the Jewish community, took great offence at the presence of a number of Palestinian writers. And I thought my job was to spotlight literary culture that we may in Australia not be aware of. This was prior to the war on Gaza. This was prior to the current crisis. So it was 2023. So we weren't there. We weren't at this point. And then News Limited took up the case, the cause, if you like, were very offended, particularly by two writers, Susan Abel-Hawa, who had tweeted a rather sensationalist tweet. I shouldn't be dismissive of it. I don't want to sound dismissive of it, but a tweet that people took great offence at regarding Zelensky, the Ukrainian Prime Minister. They thought that was absolutely appalling and that she should be cancelled. And the other writer that the Jewish establishment took against was a writer, a young poet called Muhammad al-Kurd, who had written a poem called Rafiq. I thought it was a very interesting poem. I thought the poem was a good poem, in which he referred to Israeli doctors in the 1990s harvesting the organs of Palestinian and Israelis. There was evidence, there was research, there was newspaper articles confirming an acknowledgement by Israeli doctors that this had happened at the time. He referenced that in this poem. He was then accused of blood libel, which is a phrase that is used all too often, in my view, and in a slapdash and uninformed fashion. But he was accused of blood libel. So there was a pile-on, and calling for these writers to be cancelled, for me to be sacked. And the Advertiser also took up the cudgels, the warfare. The Ukrainian community in Adelaide aligned themselves with the establishment organisations within the Jewish community. So there was a great to-do. Interestingly, at the actual festival, there was civil, courteous, and respectful engagement. There was no yelling. There were no obscenities. There was a silent protest of 6 Ukrainian women, I think they were, on the side of one event that we had with Susan Abel-Hawa. I think one of the representatives of the Ukrainian community walked across the stage at one point and yelled at Susan Abel-Hawa, who answered, thankfully and appropriately, with great humanity for the plight of Ukrainian people and what was happening in the Ukraine. It all went to sort of dissipated, if you like. All of the to-do, the media pile-on, sort of dissipated in the reality of the festival. I thought that was fantastic. I thought we proved, as South Australia has often done, the capacity for us to hear each other's views, to contest each other's opinions, and robustly and respectfully. I thought it was a success.
And you were backed by your board?
The board was unequivocally supportive. They were terrific. I was interested, and the lobby went out of its way to encourage sponsors to withdraw from the festival, and they did the rounds. They rang the Premier and urged him to cancel our funding. I mean, it was no stone was left unturned in this to-do. I was interested, though, one sponsor, Minter Ellison, decided that they would withdraw their support for that particular year. And I was interested that the former chair of the board said, well, in response to that, it's for us to review whether we feel that the relationship is there's an appropriate fit between us and our sponsors. And it was the first time I'd heard a chair of a festival actually saying that there's a reciprocal responsibility here for the sponsors and the donors to agree that this is a fit, we like what these people are doing or we don't, and also for us to say this is appropriate.
I mean, they're entitled, obviously, to have that view as private donors. The problem
And to take their checkbooks, Paul, and to walk away. You're perfect. Of course, it is your good right. I wouldn't support an organisation whose values I didn't support. I completely support that idea that you align yourself with the values you support. And if you don't, if they're not, they don't align with yours, you take your checkbook and walk away.
But there will be problems. There will be flare-ups. You've experienced one that you just described. Do arts boards themselves, on the whole, need to be braver, need to, stand up to donors, better educate donors perhaps about what donation to the arts means? Because let's face it, it is the remit of arts and culture to address social and political conversations that are going on around them.
That I agree, and I think it is incumbent upon the boards and the management of arts organisations to have those discussions with sponsors and donors and to outline the kind of rules of the game, the protocols, the respectful relationship we expect, mutual respect.
And how do you mitigate?
But sorry, Paul, I should just say, forgive me for interrupting. I think the counter view is, I've heard this countless times, I don't come to the theatre to be harangued by your politics. Well, I say, with all courtesy and all respect, you have a choice not to go. If I have a writer here whose views you don't agree with, you're not forced to sit there and listen to him or her or them. You can walk away, or you can raise your hand and ask a question and contest that individual's views. That's the miracle of living in a democracy like Australia.
The question I was going to ask is, how do you go about perceiving the obstacles, the problems that may lay ahead because of the people that you've invited, you've just put together the schedule, I imagine, for the upcoming Writers' Week. There'll be people there who are outspoken. That's your job. Do you sit down and kind of talk about what some of those potholes could be ahead, and how do you plan that?
I think that we could sell our risk analysis. And I think every other arts organisation in Australia has exactly the same. We were all duplicating the work of saying, if X happens, what does Y do? And if A gets up and abuses B, what will we do? And when do we call the police? And when does the stage manager get up and say, this session is now concluded? Thank you for your lack of civility. And we've all got them in place. Of course we should. And I think we've all got those, documents, successive documents on managing risk.
I'm Paul Barclay. I'm talking to Louise Adler, currently the director of Adelaide Writers' Week, former CEO and publisher of Melbourne University Press. We're discussing the state of Australia's cultural organisations, how they're funded and supported, how we can best foster an independent and vibrant arts sector. Louise has written about this in What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute. You can buy it now. It features chapters by Yanis Varoufakis, Jennifer Robertson, Lucy Turnbull, Richard Dennis, and other leading thinkers. And they remind us that the solutions to our big challenges are there. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. What's the Big Idea? Available online from the Australia Institute website. You mentioned earlier about the precarious nature of being an artist, and I've been thinking about this. Some of my friends are artists, writers, musicians, and so on. Their work overall is incredibly poorly paid, insecure, short-term contracts. I feel like they make such a contribution to the society that I live in. I'm so grateful that they are there. God knows what their superannuation looks like. Any thoughts on how we can go about improving this situation?
Good question. I want the state, I want governments to free us from the tyranny. We spend so much of our time as arts managers, if you like, administrators, finding money, sources of money other than government funding. If only there was sufficient to support an arts ecology in its variety. If only we had that support from government. I wish. Am I dreaming? Is it a utopian notion at this point in time? Probably. But that's all I can think. That, it's the problem of the uncertainty and the infrequency, the irregularity of support that makes it incredibly difficult.
Is the overall decline in support in terms of funding, do you think it's another symptom of kind of neoliberalism, for want of a better term, or could the arts sector do a better job of advocating for itself? Just looking at some of these numbers, Once again, Australia Institute research showing the sector contributed, these are 2017-18 figures, but just under $15 billion to the economy. In 2020, 3.5% of national employment was in the arts and related sectors, about 460,000 people, 4 times more than in coal mining. So do you think the sector that you're involved in could be better at articulating its case for more of the public purse?
I certainly do think we could lobby harder. I think of all the sectors in the arts, ecology that have done best is the film industry. Not that they're triumphing in, the challenges of, Australian-made films by Australians for Australians. Still, such a poor, modest proportion of the films that are supported, by Australian audiences. Really, really always been tough. But I think that stars, Kate Blanchett and people like this, they can go. They have razzmatazz and star power and celebrity status, and I think that our government, our politicians of the day like to be associated with people like that. So I think they advocate for their cause better than, for example, our wonderful writers who are dragged from their desks into the public sphere and write work that lives on in many cases for generations, and yet they're not their job. And the way they work, they're not public in the same way. They want their work to speak for itself, and I can't blame. I think I understand it, but advocating then for us and for literary culture, for example, is one sector, and becomes very difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, speaking about that sector, the writing and publishing sector, just recently the independent publisher Text was taken over by Penguin Random House. I know some of the employees of Text feel somewhat relieved about this, actually, because their situation was not looking great. But nonetheless, other indie publishers too, Affirm Press, Pantera, recently been acquired by large publishers. I just wonder how concerned we should be about this trend and how it affects the diversity of voices and titles that are published.
It always does. Every time there's a contraction, every time there's an the amalgamations or the mergers, I think what we've seen, despite all the goodwill on both sides, inevitably, there's rationalisation of, people are made redundant. The work, what is published contracts. I think it's a cyclical business. We have the rise of independence, fabulous independence. Remember back to McPhee-Gribble days. And once it was acquired by Penguin in those days, in the end, didn't take long, was it? I might not be correct about this. Did it take 2 years? Did it take 5 years for the imprint to sort of fade away, which is tragic after the immensely important contribution that imprint and, McPhee-Gribble made to our Australian culture. I think we'll probably see the same for Text and Affirm. In the end, that's the rationale. And, you don't get acquired to stay the same. You get acquired because the imprint has value and status. And then we see it, I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but most of the time what one sees is that they fade into oblivion.
And what does that mean for the mid-list writer or the small independent writer with a niche following? Do they just fall by the wayside?
Fall by the wayside. It's increasingly difficult. I have the pleasure of being on the judging panel for the Mud Prize. It's a prize that's given to debut novels. There are lots of debut novels being published. Most of them don't succeed in the marketplace. It's extremely difficult to get noticed, to have any presence in the bookshops for any length of time. Enormously difficult. We're the best in the world. And what you see, I think when publishers publish debut novels, it's a gesture of optimism. I believe in this novel. I believe in this author. I think they've got something to say. We want to make this work. And in the end, it's not all, that's what I found heartbreaking about publishing. It's not all in our hands. You can make the book beautiful. You can give it the best edit you can. You can have a fabulous author who's able to go out there and promote their work. It doesn't mean that it sells in the end. And if your first book doesn't sell, it's hard to get your second book to be bought by a publisher, and so on and so on. So I think it's a really heartbreaking business.
And just before we wrap it up, I suppose the issue on everybody's lips, not just in the arts sector, but just generally, is artificial intelligence. How concerned should artists be, writers, performers, you name it, be about AI undermining their craft?
I think we should be, and I hope there's work being done by, for example, the Australian Publishers Association, as there is work being done in the US and the UK on the consequences of AI and what it might mean. I know that, for example, in the film industry, there's been a lot of work on, what are the kind of rights, what are the intellectual property rights of the individual author, as opposed to, the producer bringing in, a bot to kind of, or whatever it is, to create content. I mean, very disturbing if you say, actually what matters is the creative imagination of the artist or the writer. That's what's unique. And, an algorithm or whatever can't replace that. And I think that's sacred. It sounds so, pious or, sort of idealistic, but I think that's what's sacred. If we don't hold true to that, to the individuality, the uniqueness of the literary or the creative imagination, we're a very much poorer culture for that.
Do you feel optimistic, Louise?
It's hard to be optimistic at this particular moment in history with what's going on in the world beyond culture. Or, well, what will happen to culture? For example, what will Mr. Trump, the deal maker of the century, what will Mr. Trump's world look like in the next 4 years? What will he do to arts and culture? One trembles.
Always great to talk to you. Thanks a lot, Louise.
Thank you, Paul.
Louise Adler is currently the director of Adelaide Writers Week, a former CEO and publisher of Melbourne University Press. She's worn many hats in the cultural sphere over the decades, including board member and senior executive. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved. And if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer, more creative Australia. Thanks for listening.